So for most of you, this will be a review, but we will talk about two different types of visual data. This corresponds to Chapter 7 of Gaston Ledford. And overall, it just gives a really broad overview of visual data, what it means, why we do it, and the basic types of visual data that we use in ABA. So basically, we graph to organize our data and make formative decisions based on that data. So based off of a visual graph, we can very quickly see if there is an increase in behavior, a decrease in behavior, and if there could be a functional relationship between behavior and intervention. It gives us a really detailed summary of that data, and then we can analyze those trends. So the two different types we typically use are line graphs and bar graphs. In general, when we are in the field, we rely on line graphs because we can graph daily progress, so day to day. We can take our data and graph it. So typically with a line graph, you can graph multiple behaviors. Usually at most 3 per graph. However, I have seen graphs with a very detailed key and and several different behaviors. They do become more and more confusing the more behaviors you graph, but around 3 is appropriate. And then line graphs are just really easily understood. So below here is an example of a line graph and all of the different components of the graph. So if you guys remember last quarter, one of your final questions was, what are the different components of the graph? So these are the components. You have your x-axis, you have your y-axis, you have phase change lines or condition change lines, you have your data path, you have your data points, all of those good things. Those are the components of your graph. So during that final last quarter, that's what I was really asking about when we analyzed that multiple baseline graph, and it said, what are the components, and then how do we know if there's a functional relationship? So in this picture here, these are the components. So with your line graph, you indicate any type of intervention changes with phase change lines. And then you would state what the intervention or the change is in pre-phase change line, post-phase change line. And then your x-axis is typically over time, and your y-axis is is the thing you're measuring, your dependent variable. So that is really quickly your line graphs in a nutshell, and then you have your basic bar graphs. So bar graphs are really useful when we want to display comparative information. You can have a number of different types of bar graphs in how they're displayed. So sometimes they are horizontal and sometimes they're vertical. But this is really good when you don't necessarily have continuous data, right? So this is for discrete data, so comparison. So below here is an example with all of the components. So this indicates pre-test and post-test conditions, and again, you use a phase change line just like a line graph. And then you always want to have a key for bar graphs as well. On the bottom here, you'll always see your variables, so what you're measuring, and then there's typically a scale from either percentage or number of responses. There's some sort of scale on the y-axis to indicate what those bars are displaying. Again, bar graphs really easy to understand, and visually you can definitely see that there is a clear difference in pre-test and post-test conditions, especially for percent correct in this example here. We don't typically use them day to day in ABA though, but this would be a really great way to summarize information. Line graphs, we definitely typically see day to day use in ABA. So practicality wise, you'll probably be doing line graphs more frequently than bar graphs.